The letter arrived on a Tuesday. No return address. No name. Inside, a single photograph of Mara Bellamy standing outside a bank in Billings, and a handwritten note that read, "Tell her to leave Ironwood before she ends up like her husband." Silas Blackridge dropped it on the table in front of his hired man and said, without looking up from his coffee, "Make sure she finds it." He wasn't asking, he wasn't warning, he was already done with the conversation. That is the kind of man Silas Blackridge was, the kind who destroys people the way a man stubs out a cigarette, without anger, without hesitation, without a second glance downward. What he never calculated was that the woman in that photograph had already survived one thing that should have broken her. She wasn't going to survive a second time, she was going to fight back. If this story moves you, if you've ever lost something and wondered whether you had the strength to start again, please subscribe to this channel and follow every part of this story to the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The advertisement was 12 words long. Cook wanted, Ironwood Ranch. No nonsense. Inquire at the gate. G. Rourke. It had been tacked to the post office board in Dry Creek Crossing for 11 days before Mara Bellamy pulled it down, folded it twice, and tucked it into the front pocket of her dress. The woman behind her in line saw her do it and said nothing, but her eyes said plenty. Everyone in Dry Creek Crossing knew about Ironwood Ranch. Everyone knew about Gideon Rourke, and every last one of them knew that any woman foolish enough to walk out there looking for work was either desperate enough not to care what she was walking into or stupid enough not to know. Mara was neither. She was 34 years old, recently widowed, and down to her last $11.40. Her boots had been resoled twice. Her suitcase, a brown leather thing with a cracked hinge, was held shut with a length of braided cord she'd taken from the barn before she left her late husband's farm for the last time. She had not eaten a full meal in 3 days, not because she was too proud to ask for help, but because there was simply no one left to ask. Her husband, Thomas, had been a good man, patient, quiet, the kind of man who fixed fences in the dark so the cattle wouldn't wander and never once expected anyone to notice. He'd died in March, 8 months earlier, not from anything dramatic, a chest infection that turned on him in 4 days. By the time the doctor arrived from town, Thomas was already gone. The farm went to creditors 2 weeks later. The neighbors brought food for the first month, then life moved on, the way it always does, and Mara was left with the worn boots and the cracked suitcase and the $11.40 and the very clear understanding that no one was coming to save her. That was fine. She hadn't been waiting for anyone to save her. She'd been waiting for work. The walk from Dry Creek Crossing to Ironwood Ranch was 4 miles on a dirt road that ran nearly due west, and she walked it on a Tuesday in the middle of July when the temperature hadn't dropped below 90 since the first of the month. She carried the suitcase in her right hand and switched it to her left when her arm went numb, and she kept her eyes on the road because looking at the horizon in that heat only made the distance seem worse. A wagon passed her going the other direction about 2 miles out. The driver, a man she didn't recognize, looked at her the way people look at something they know they should stop for but don't, and kept going. She didn't flag him down. She kept walking. The iron gate at the entrance to Ironwood Ranch was the largest thing she'd seen since leaving Billings 3 years earlier. 2 massive posts sunk into the earth with the ranch's brand worked into the metal overhead, the letters heavy and permanent as a courthouse door. The gate itself stood open, which surprised her. She'd half expected it to be locked. She walked through it and down the long drive, past the fenced pastures where cattle moved slow and stupid in the heat, past a bunkhouse where 2 ranch hands stopped what they were doing and stared at her with the unguarded curiosity of men who didn't see strangers come walking down that drive very often. She didn't slow down. The main house was large, larger than she'd pictured. 2 stories of weathered timber and stone with a deep covered porch running the full length of the front. It might have been handsome once, and probably still was by most measures, but there was something about it that felt sealed. The curtains on the upper windows were drawn tight even in midday. The porch furniture, 2 heavy wooden chairs and a small table, looked like it hadn't been moved in years. There were no flowers, no garden, no evidence that anyone had bothered to make the outside of the house look like anything other than a wall between whatever was inside and the rest of the world. She climbed the porch steps. She knocked on the door. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. Boots on wood floors, measured and unhurried, and then the door opened and Gideon Rourke was looking at her. He was taller than she'd expected, lean in the way that men get lean when they've stopped remembering to eat regularly. Not frail, but stripped down, like something left out in the weather for too long. He had dark hair going silver at the temples, a jaw that needed shaving, and eyes so pale a gray they were nearly colorless in the harsh afternoon light. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he had the look of a man who had opened this door expecting someone else entirely and was already forming the words to send her away. He looked at her. He looked at the suitcase. He looked back at her face. "You're here about the position," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "How'd you get here?" "I walked." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but the briefest recalculation. "From town?" "From the post office," she said. 4 miles, give or take. I was quiet for a moment. "Most women send a letter first." "Most women have time to send letters," Mara said. "I'm not most women. I'm also not most cooks. If you want references, I have 2 former employers I can name and you can write to both of them. Though I'll warn you it'll take a week to hear back, and from the look of things, your kitchen hasn't had a functioning occupant in longer than that." He stared at her. She held his gaze without any particular effort. "You'd better come in," he said finally. The inside of the house was not what she expected either, though it confirmed everything she'd suspected from the outside. The front rooms were clean but cold. Not cold in temperature, but cold in the way a room feels when no one has actually lived in it for a long time. The furniture was good quality. Nothing was dirty. But there were no books left open, no cups half finished on tables, no evidence of the casual disorder that comes from a house where someone is actually at home. It felt less like a home than like a museum of one. He took her to the kitchen. That was when she understood the full scale of what she was looking at. The kitchen was large, built for a working ranch, with a cast-iron stove that could have cooked for 20 men and a table long enough to seat that many. But the stove was cold. The shelves had supplies on them, but they were organized the way supplies get organized when nobody uses them regularly. Too tidy, things pushed to the back, nothing at the front worn from daily reach. There was a smell that wasn't bad exactly, but wasn't right either. The smell of a room that had been cleaned but not cooked in. "When was the last time someone used this kitchen?" she asked. 3 weeks. "What have your hands been eating?" A pause that told her everything. "What they can get in town." Mara set her suitcase down on the floor and turned around slowly, taking stock of the room, the way a field surgeon takes stock of a tent, counting what was there, calculating what wasn't, deciding what order to fix things in. "I'll need the stove cleaned out and properly lit within the hour," she said. "Whatever's in your cold storage, I'll need a list. And whoever's been letting the sourdough go needs to be told that a starter left unattended for 3 weeks is not coming back." Gideon was leaning in the doorway. He hadn't moved. "You're very certain of yourself for someone I haven't hired yet." "You're going to hire me," she said, not unkindly, without turning around. "You've had that advertisement up for 11 days, and I'm the only one who came. That tells me something about your reputation in town. And it tells me something about how badly you need someone who isn't scared of your reputation." She turned to face him then. "I'm not scared of it, Mr. Rourke. I'm scared of going another week without work. Those are very different things." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might still turn her away. $30 a month, he said, room and board included. You'll cook 3 meals a day for the hands and 1 for the house. You don't need to interact with me beyond what the work requires. That's fine. There's a room off the kitchen. It's small. I've slept in smaller. I'll need you to stay out of the upper floor of the house. She didn't ask why. She could see it in his face. The upper floor was not a negotiation. Understood. You start tomorrow morning. I start in an hour, Mara said. Those men need to eat something tonight. He blinked. For just a fraction of a second, something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. Something between surprise and the ghost of something older, sadder. All right, he said quietly. He pushed off the doorframe and walked away, and she turned back to the kitchen. She'd made harder starts than this one. She put water on to heat and rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The ranch hands ate better that first night than they had in weeks, and they all knew it without anyone saying so. She made what she could from what was available, a thick beef stew with dried beans and whatever root vegetables hadn't gone soft, biscuits from scratch, coffee, hot enough to mean something. It wasn't her best work. She'd been cooking in an unfamiliar kitchen on an uneven stove she hadn't fully learned yet, on 3 days of too little food and 4 miles of July road in her legs. But it was hot, and it was real, and when the ranch hands came in from the day and sat down at the long table in the cookhouse, the silence that fell over them when they started eating was the particular silence of men who hadn't expected to feel grateful about supper, and suddenly did. Caleb Finch sat at the far end of the table. He was the youngest of the hands by at least 5 years, 19, maybe 20 at a stretch, with the build of someone who hadn't quite grown into himself yet, and the habit of making himself small in a room, shoulders slightly forward, eyes aimed a few inches below the horizon when he talked to people. One of the older hands said something to him just before he sat down, something low enough that Mara only caught the end of it, but she caught Caleb's face and saw the quick drop of his chin that meant it wasn't the first time he'd heard whatever it was. She said nothing that night. She noted it. After supper, after the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse, and she'd cleaned the cookhouse as well as the hour allowed, Mara walked back across the yard to the main house. The light was on in a room on the ground floor. She could see it through the window, and the silhouette of Gideon Rourke, standing, not sitting, with a glass in his hand and his back to the room. She didn't stop to watch, but she had been married to a quiet man for 8 years. She knew what a man looked like when he was standing in a room because sitting down had become unbearable. She went to her room off the kitchen. It was small, as he'd said. A single bed, a washstand, a window that faced east. She unpacked her suitcase, what there was of it, a change of clothes, a small photograph of Thomas that she kept wrapped in a handkerchief, a notebook with her recipes, a book she'd been reading for 5 months and was only halfway through because she never had quite enough light or quiet to make real progress. She sat on the edge of the bed. She was exhausted in a way that went beyond the body. The deep, accumulated exhaustion of someone who had been holding everything together by themselves for too long. She'd told herself she wasn't going to cry tonight. She'd cried enough over the past 8 months. There was nothing useful left in it. She didn't cry. She lay back on the bed with her boots still on and stared at the ceiling in the dark and thought about Thomas, not the way she usually thought about him, with the dull, specific ache of missing, but with something that felt almost like gratitude. He taught her how to keep accounts. He taught her that the way to know if a situation was salvageable was to look at what you had, not at what you'd lost. She had a room. She had work. She had $30 a month coming. That was more than she'd had this morning. She turned off the lamp and slept without dreaming, and in the morning she was up before 5, the stove going and the first batch of biscuits in the oven before a single ranch hand had opened the door to the bunkhouse. In the main house, on the upper floor, there was a door that hadn't been unlocked in 7 years. Gideon didn't go near it. He hadn't gone near it on purpose in so long that the avoidance had become structural, a part of the house's layout that existed only in his mind, a room that wasn't a room anymore, a door that wasn't a door. Margaret's room. Margaret's things. Everything still exactly as she had left it on the last morning she'd been well enough to arrange anything before the fever had taken her inside of a week and left him standing in the hall outside that closed door trying to understand how the world had continued existing when the most essential part of it had simply stopped. 7 years. He had kept the rest of the house clean and cold and functional. He had worked the ranch the way a man works when work is the only thing left that doesn't require him to feel anything, relentlessly, efficiently, without affection. He had driven off 4 cooks in the past 3 years, 2 of them within the first week. The last one, a woman from Billings who'd come with excellent references and immediately begun making suggestions about the upper floor, had lasted 9 days before he'd paid her out and told her to take the next wagon back to town. That was not what this new one was like. She hadn't asked about the upper floor. She hadn't looked at the house like she was calculating what it was worth or what position inside it might be available. She had walked 4 miles in July heat and looked him directly in the eye and told him, without performance or apology, that she was there to cook, and then she had gone and cooked. He hadn't eaten dinner last night, but he had stood in the doorway of the darkened dining room for a long time, and he had smelled the stew and the biscuits from across the house, and for the first time in 7 years, the smell of a real meal cooking inside Ironwood Ranch had made him feel something other than nothing. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He went to bed without eating. He lay awake longer than usual. In the morning, when he came downstairs, the kitchen was already running at full pitch, the stove roaring, biscuits on the counter, coffee going. And Mara Bellamy was standing at the work table with her back to him, cutting something with the economy of motion of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her hair pinned up but already coming loose on one side. She heard him. She didn't turn around. "There's coffee," she said. He poured himself a cup. He stood in the kitchen of his own house, in the morning light, and drank it. He could not remember the last time he had done that. It was just coffee. It meant nothing. He told himself that twice before he put the cup down and went outside into the yard to begin the day. Behind him, he heard her go back to work. No comment, no acknowledgement, just the rhythmic sound of someone who knew exactly what they were there for. He stood on the porch for a moment before going down the steps. Something in his chest felt strange. Not pain. He knew what pain felt like. He'd been living inside it for 7 years. This was different. It was something smaller and older and much harder to name. He didn't let himself name it. He went to work. The second week was when Dry Creek Crossing decided it had an opinion. It started the way most things started in a small town. Not with a confrontation, but with a conversation. Two women talking outside the dry goods store. A remark made over a back fence. A question asked in the post office that wasn't really a question at all. And then somehow, within the space of 4 or 5 days, the remark and the question and the fence conversation had combined into something with a shape and a direction, and that shape was pointed directly at Mara Bellamy. She heard about it first from Caleb. He came in from town on a Thursday afternoon with the supply wagon and a look on his face like a man who'd been told something he didn't know how to carry, and when Mara asked him what was wrong, she'd gotten good at reading his face in the 2 weeks she'd been at Ironwood. It wasn't a complicated face once you learned it. He set the flour sacks down on the kitchen table and said, without looking at her, "People are talking, ma'am." "People talk everywhere," she said. "That's not news." "They're talking about you." She kept her hands moving, rolling the bread dough, not breaking rhythm. "What are they saying?" Caleb's jaw shifted. He was the kind of young man who hated delivering bad news. She could see it in the way his whole body resisted the words. "That you came out here because you're after Mr. Rourke's money. That you—" He stopped, started again. "That a woman in your situation wouldn't take a job that far out of town unless she was planning on more than cooking." The dough got a harder push than it needed. "Who's saying it?" "Mostly Mrs. Vane," he said. "Lenora Vane. She owns the land east of town. She talks and people listen. That's how it is." Mara was quiet for a moment. The dough, the stove, the sound of the afternoon outside. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "I didn't know if I should." "You should always tell someone the truth, even when it's uncomfortable," she said, "especially then." He nodded, unhappy about all of it, and picked up the empty flour sacks and took them back outside. And Mara stood at the work table and breathed through her nose for a count of 5, and thought about Lenora Vane, a woman she had never met, and the particular cruelty of people who used other people's misfortune as entertainment. She punched the dough once, hard, and then shaped it into loaves. She did not tell Gideon. There was nothing to tell yet. Rumors were weather. They moved through, they did damage sometimes, and the only thing that stopped them was time and the absence of anything interesting enough to keep feeding them. She would do her work, she would be exactly what she'd said she was, and Lenora Vane would eventually find something else to talk about. That was what she told herself. She was wrong. The rumors got to Gideon before she could decide whether to tell him herself. He came back from town on a Saturday. He went maybe once a week for business, the kind of business that required his signature on things and couldn't be delegated. And he walked into the kitchen that evening with the particular quietness of a man who had heard something and was deciding what to do with it. Mara was cleaning up after supper. She heard his boots on the floor behind her. "Did someone say something to you in town?" she asked, without turning. "Not to me," he said. She turned around then. His face was composed in the way faces get composed when the person behind them is actively working to keep it that way. There was something underneath it that she recognized. Not anger, exactly. Controlled anger. The kind that had been compressed until it was something harder and more durable than plain rage. "The Vane woman," she said, "among others." "What did they say?" He looked at her steadily. "The usual thing people say when a widow takes work at a widower's property." She held his gaze. "And you believed them?" "No," he said. and the word came out flat and immediate, no hesitation. I didn't believe them. I'm telling you because you have a right to know what's being said about you, and because if you want to leave, if this isn't worth the trouble it's bringing you, I'll pay you through the month and write you a reference that'll get you work anywhere in the territory. Mara was quiet. She looked at him for a long moment, at the tight set of his jaw, at the way his hands were absolutely still at his sides, at the pale gray eyes that were, she had noticed over the past 2 weeks, considerably less empty than she'd originally thought. I walked 4 miles in July heat to take this job, she said. I'm not walking away from it because Lenora Vane has too much time and too small a life. Something released in his expression, very slightly, barely visible, but she was watching for it and she caught it. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. He turned to leave and then stopped, half turned back. The bread you've been making, he said. The sourdough. Where did you learn it? The question surprised her. It was the first thing he'd asked her that wasn't related to the work itself. My mother, she said. She learned from hers. I kept the starter going for years on our farm. She paused. I had to leave it behind when I left. His face did something complicated quickly. I'll add sourdough starter to the next supply order, he said, if you want to build a new one. She didn't know what to say for a moment. Thank you, she said. He nodded once and left. She stood in the kitchen after he'd gone and looked at the door he'd walked through and tried to figure out what had just happened, and couldn't quite get there. She went back to cleaning up. She had been at Ironwood 3 weeks when Silas Blackridge came for the first time. She didn't see him arrive. She heard him, or rather heard about him, from 2 of the ranch hands talking too loudly outside the kitchen window. A man from back east, they said. Expensive suit. Came in a private rig with a driver. Met with Mr. Rourke for about 40 minutes and left in the same direction he'd come from, without getting out of the rig again, without stopping, without any of the easy lingering of a man who felt welcome. She was curious, but she didn't ask Gideon. He came to supper that night, which he was doing more regularly now, not every night, but maybe 3 or 4 times a week, sitting at the end of the long kitchen table that she'd started using for the household meals since the formal dining room felt like a place where food went to feel bad about itself. He ate without speaking much, the way he always did, but there was a tightness to his shoulders that hadn't been there the previous night. You don't have to tell me, Mara said, pouring the coffee. Tell you what? Whatever's sitting on your chest like a stone right now. He looked up at her. She kept her face neutral, not pushing. He looked back down at his coffee. A man named Blackridge, he said finally. He wants to buy the ranch. He's been wanting to buy it for 3 months. Tonight he came in person to make the offer more, he paused, looking for the right word, emphatic. How emphatic? He told me the offer had an expiration date. Gideon's voice was even. He was very polite about it, very smooth. He said the market conditions that made Ironwood valuable were temporary, and that if I waited too long to sell, I'd find the property worth considerably less. He picked up his coffee. He said it like a friend giving me advice. Did you believe it? No. He set the cup down. I also didn't like the way he said it. Men who come in polished suits to tell you your property is losing value while simultaneously making you an enormous offer to buy it are not usually doing you a favor. What are you going to do? Same thing I told him, Gideon said. Ironwood's not for sale. She nodded. He finished his coffee and pushed back from the table and was nearly at the door when he stopped. He knew your name, Gideon said, not turning around. Blackridge. He mentioned that you'd recently come to work here. He said it the way people mention things they want you to notice them mentioning. He turned then and looked at her. I don't know what that means, but I thought you should know. Mara felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. Thank you, she said. He nodded. The door closed behind him. She sat at the table for a long time after that, the coffee cooling in front of her, and thought about a man in a polished suit who already knew her name. The anonymous letters started a week later. The first one was left at the Ironwood gate, tucked under the latch, with no envelope and no name. Caleb found it in the morning and brought it to Gideon without reading it. Gideon read it in his office and came to find Mara in the kitchen an hour later. He put the letter on the table in front of her. She read it. It accused her of stealing $20 from her previous employer, a family in Billings, whose name she recognized because she had, in fact, worked for them briefly 2 years ago. The accusation was specific and confident and completely, entirely fabricated. Her hands were very still on the table. "You don't have to say anything," Gideon said. "I didn't steal from them," she said. "I can prove it. I have their letter of reference in my room." "I know you didn't steal from them." She looked up at him. "I've been watching you work for 3 weeks," he said. "I know what you are." He took the letter back, folded it, and put it in his coat pocket. She watched him do it and thought about what it took, what it actually cost a man who'd spent 7 years building walls, to say that out loud. "This is a Black Ridge," she said. "Probably. He's trying to force you to send me away." Gideon's jaw was a hard line. "I'm aware of that." "Why would he care whether I'm here or not?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet." The second letter arrived 4 days later. This one said something worse, implied with careful vagueness that Mara's husband Thomas had not died naturally, and that the circumstances of his death and the subsequent loss of the farm deserved further inquiry. It didn't make a direct accusation. It didn't have to. It just planted the question and let it sit there like something rotting in the walls. Gideon found her in the kitchen garden when he came to tell her about it. She was pulling weeds from between the bean rows, which she'd spent 2 Sundays rehabilitating from their neglected state, and she was kneeling in the dirt with her hands working and her face turned down when he walked up and crouched beside her and read her the letter in a low voice. She kept pulling weeds for about 30 seconds after he finished reading. Then she sat back on her heels and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and said, in a voice that was almost entirely steady, "Thomas died of a chest infection in March of last year. The doctor's name was Aldred Moss from Clancy. He filed a record. There are witnesses." She paused. "My husband was the most decent man I have ever known, and whoever wrote that letter will not be able to say the same thing about themselves." Gideon was quiet. She looked at him, and she didn't have the strength right then to hide all of it. The anger, the grief underneath the anger, the particular humiliation of having the dead dragged into someone else's business scheme. He didn't look away. "I'm sorry," he said. "And it didn't sound like something you say because you don't know what else to say." It sounded like he meant it. She nodded once, not trusting herself to speak. They stayed like that for a moment, crouched in the garden in the afternoon heat, close enough that she could have reached out and touched his arm if she'd been the kind of woman who did things like that. She wasn't. She got up and went back to work. The fence came down 10 days later. It wasn't an accident. Fences don't cut themselves in 4 places along the same half-mile stretch, not with the kind of clean cuts that come from wire snips rather than stress fractures. Gideon found it on his morning round and didn't come back to the house until noon, by which time 11 head of cattle had wandered through the gap and were spread across the dry eastern quarter of the neighboring land, which belonged to a man named Aldous Webb, who was, at least, decent about it. 2 of the hands spent the afternoon rounding them up. 3 more spent it restringing fence. Gideon spent it very quiet in a way that Mara had come to understand meant something more specific than it looked. It wasn't the silence of a man who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a man saying everything he didn't want to say out loud, so he wouldn't do something he couldn't take back. She brought supper out to the men working the fence line herself that evening, loading it onto the wagon and driving it out because it was faster than waiting for them to come in. Caleb was there, sweating through his shirt, struggling with a section of wire that kept slipping out of the post staple. The older hand next to him, a man named Durst, who had worked at Ironwood for 4 years and treated Caleb with the same flat contempt he seemed to have for anything that required patience, said something under his breath when the wire slipped again, and Caleb's face went to that closed-off place it went when he was trying not to react to something. Mara climbed down from the wagon. She walked over to the post, positioned the wire the way it needed to be positioned. She'd restrung enough fence on Thomas's farm to know exactly what she was doing, held it in place with both hands, and told Caleb where to set the staple. He got it in clean on the first strike. Durst said nothing. Caleb looked at her, surprised. "You did that right," she told him. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." He nodded, jaw tight, eyes somewhere between embarrassed and grateful. She went back to the wagon. The livestock contract collapsed on a Wednesday. Gideon had held the same contract with a buyer in Helena for 5 years, a reliable arrangement that moved 120 head every season and accounted for a significant portion of Ironwood's income. The letter arrived by courier and said, with corporate politeness, that due to changed market circumstances, the buyer would not be renewing. No explanation beyond that. No negotiation offered. Gideon brought the letter to the kitchen that night. Not because he needed her advice, she knew that much, but because he had started coming to the kitchen when things were difficult, and she had started understanding that this was not weakness on his part. It was something else. The kitchen had become the only room in Ironwood Ranch that felt like something other than a place to endure things. "This is deliberate," she said. "Yes." "Blackridge has influence with the buyer." "It appears so." He sat down at the table, which was unusual. He generally stood in doorways, half in and half out, as though committing to a chair was committing to something. "This isn't about the money. He can hurt me financially, but he can't break Ironwood over one contract. He knows that." "Then what is it about?" "Pressure," Gideon said. "He's applying pressure from every direction he can reach. The letters, the fence, the contract. He wants me—" He stopped and something shifted in his face, something she couldn't quite read. "He wants me uncomfortable enough to be uncertain. Men who are uncertain make bad decisions." She thought about that. "What's under this land?" she asked. He looked at her. "You said he wants Ironwood specifically. There are other ranches in this territory. What makes this one worth the trouble he's going to?" A long pause. "A survey came through 2 years ago," he said slowly. "A geological survey. The report said there might be significant mineral deposits in the eastern quarter. I had a second opinion done that said the first survey was optimistic to the point of being unreliable." He paused. "I didn't think about it again after that." "Who did the first survey?" "A man named Silas Crow." The name meant nothing to her, but the repetition of it in her mind had a texture to it she didn't like. "Do you still have the report?" "Somewhere. Why?" She shook her head, not ready yet. It was just a thread. She needed to pull it a little more before she knew what it was attached to. "I'll tell you when I know what I'm looking at." He studied her face. "You're not just a cook," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation, delivered like most of his observations. Flat, direct, stripped of everything unnecessary. "I ran a farm's accounts for 8 years, she said. "You learn to look for things that don't add up." He was quiet. Then, unexpectedly, "My wife would have liked you." The sentence arrived in this kitchen and sat there between them, enormous and fragile, like something dropped from a great height that somehow hadn't broken. Mara didn't know what to say. "She was direct," he said, and his voice had changed. Not broken, but changed, the way a road changes when it passes through different terrain. "Margaret. She didn't have any patience for people who said things sideways." He looked down at the table. She would have looked at Lenora Vane and said exactly what she thought, and then probably apologized for it later and meant both things equally. The silence stretched. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Mara said carefully. He nodded once and didn't say anything more, and after a moment he got up from the table and said goodnight and left, and Mara sat in the kitchen listening to his footsteps cross the floor above her and stop at the top of the stairs. In the hallway where she knew, though she'd never been up there, the locked door stood. The footsteps paused for a long time. Then they moved away. Then the light under the door at the top of the stairs went out. She sat in the kitchen for another hour, thinking about mineral surveys and a man named Silas Crow, and the way Gideon Rourke had said his dead wife's name in a kitchen that smelled like bread and coffee, like it was the most natural thing in the world and the hardest thing he'd ever done. The neighbors started coming forward in the 3rd week of August. It wasn't organized. It was the way these things happen, one conversation finding another conversation, a shared wound making itself known in the way shared wounds do. Aldous Webb came by first, ostensibly to return a fence tool he'd borrowed from one of the hands. He sat with Gideon on the porch for an hour, and from the kitchen, Mara could hear the conversation moving through ranges. Practical at first, then lower, then the particular heaviness of men confirming what they'd each been afraid to say. Webb's waterline had been contaminated 3 weeks earlier. Stock tank filled from a tributary that ran through the eastern corner of his land. 2 calves dead. A third sold early because he couldn't afford the risk. He'd attributed it to drought conditions affecting the water table. Now, after everything else, he wasn't so sure. 2 days later, a woman named Clara Foss arrived. Her husband had gone to Billings for supplies, and Clara had come alone in a wagon, which in that part of the territory meant something, and sat at Mara's kitchen table and told her about the loan. The Fosses had banked with the same institution in Helena for 11 years. Never late on a payment. Good standing, good history. 6 weeks ago, the bank had recalled their operating loan. Not in default, just recalled, as was technically within their rights, with an apology and 30 days to arrange alternative financing that, in a territory where every competing bank had suddenly become cautious about agricultural lending, had not been possible to arrange. Clara Foss was 51 years old and had worked that land for 23 years, and she sat at Mara's kitchen table with her hands folded and talked about it in the flat, measured way of a person who has cried about something until there's nothing left to cry and now just carries it. Mara poured the coffee and listened and thought about threads and what they connected to. "Did anyone come to you before the loan was recalled?" she asked. "Anyone wanting to buy?" Clara looked at her. "A man named Blackridge?" The name landed on Clara Foss like a stone dropped in still water. "He came in June," she said quietly. "My husband told him no." Mara thought about the mineral survey report still sitting somewhere in Gideon's office. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Did anyone survey your land recently? A geological survey?" Clara frowned. "About 2 years ago. Some fellow came through with instruments, spent 3 days out on the eastern pasture. Filed a report, I think. My husband has a copy somewhere." "Who did the survey?" Clara thought. "Crow, I think. Something Crow." Mara set her coffee cup down very carefully. She found Gideon in the barn that evening, working on a piece of harness that needed mending. He did this sometimes, she'd noticed, took up physical work with his hands when his mind was too full to stay still. He looked up when she came in, and she must have had something on her face because he straightened immediately. "What is it?" She told him what Clara had said. She told him about the loan, about the timing, about the survey. "Silas Crow," she said. "The same name, the same timeline. A survey that comes in, recommends the land is valuable for mineral extraction, and then somehow the owner ends up under financial pressure that pushes them toward selling." Gideon was very still. "You think Blackridge fabricated the surveys," he said. "I think someone named Silas Crow apparently surveyed every piece of land in this territory that Blackridge is trying to acquire," she said. "And I think that's a very convenient coincidence for a man who needs a reason to make land seem valuable enough to acquire cheaply after he's made the owners desperate enough to sell it cheap." He stared at her. "I need to see your copy of the survey report," she said, "and I need you to find out if Webb had a survey done. And I need to know if there are any other families in this territory who've had offers from Blackridge followed by problems." "There are 3 others I can think of," he said slowly. "Families who've had trouble this summer. I didn't connect it before." "No reason to," she said. "That's how it works. You keep people isolated. You make sure each person thinks they're dealing with their own bad luck and their own bad decisions. You make sure they're too embarrassed or too frightened to compare notes with their neighbors." She paused. "Blackridge's greatest weapon isn't his money. It's our distance from each other," Gideon said, and the way he said it told her he wasn't just talking about the neighboring ranches. She looked at him. He looked at her. The barn was quiet around them, the horses shifting in their stalls, the last of the evening light coming in at an angle through the open door. "I can go through the records," she said, "if you can get me the survey reports and the bank correspondence from the other families. I know how to read accounts. I know what fabricated numbers look like, and I know what real ones look like, and I can tell the difference." "This isn't your fight," he said. "It became my fight when someone wrote a letter accusing me of killing my husband," she said, quietly and precisely. "Don't tell me what my fight is." A beat. "All right," he said. She turned to leave, and then she heard him say, not loudly, barely above the sound of the horses, "Mara." She stopped. "Be careful," he said. "Whatever this is, Blackridge is not the kind of man who uses letters and cut fences when those stop working." She stood in the doorway of the barn with the last of the light at her back and thought about the photograph and the note she didn't yet know about, the one that would arrive in 9 more days, the one that would tell her to leave before she ended up like her husband. She didn't know about it yet, but something in the way Gideon said, "Be careful," told her that the letter in the photograph was not the worst thing Blackridge was capable of, and that whatever was coming next was coming fast, and that neither of them, neither the woman who'd survived one ruined life already, nor the man who'd spent 7 years locked inside his grief, had the luxury of moving slowly anymore. "I'll be careful," she said. She walked back to the house. Behind her, alone in the barn in the growing dark, Gideon Rourke stood with the mended harness in his hands and thought about a woman who had walked 4 miles in July heat and looked him in the eye without flinching and was now, apparently, the sharpest mind on his property and the only person in 3 counties who understood what was actually happening to all of them. He thought about Margaret's door at the top of the stairs. He thought about how, for the first time in 7 years, he was standing in his own barn at the end of a difficult day and feeling something other than the desire for the day to be over. He put the harness on its hook. He went inside. In the kitchen, the lamp was on, and he could hear the scratch of a pencil on paper as Mara began, without waiting to be asked, building the first of what would become the document that would eventually bring Silas Blackridge down. Neither of them knew yet what it would cost to finish it. The pencil marks on Mara's paper had grown into something that covered 3 full pages by the time the rest of the ranch went quiet that first night, and by the end of the week they covered 11. She worked at the kitchen table after supper every evening, after the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and the house had settled into its particular nighttime stillness. She'd asked Gideon for his copy of the Crow survey report, and he'd found it in the bottom drawer of his office desk, exactly where he'd put it 2 years earlier without reading past the first page. She'd asked him to write to Aldous Webb and the Foss family and 2 other ranching families he knew, the Hartleys and an older widower named Preston Cole, who ran a small operation 12 miles north, and request whatever survey documents, bank correspondence, and contract records they still had. The responses came back over the following 10 days. Every single one of them had been surveyed by Silas Crow. She lined the reports up on the table and read them side by side, and within an hour she found the first thing that didn't belong. The geological language in the Ironwood report and the language in the Webb report were not just similar, they were identical in places. Entire paragraphs describing soil composition and mineral indicators, word for word, with only the property name changed. A survey report was supposed to reflect the actual conditions of a specific piece of land. 2 different properties 12 miles apart should not produce identical paragraphs about rock stratification unless someone had written one report and then copied sections of it into all the others. She brought this to Gideon on a Thursday morning. He read the 2 paragraphs she'd marked side by side, and the color in his face changed in a way she'd learned to read over the past weeks. Not red with anger, but white. The controlled kind. "How many of the reports have identical language?" he asked. "All 5, she said. "Not entirely. Whoever wrote them was careful, but there are passages, key technical passages about what makes the mineral deposits supposedly valuable that appear almost verbatim across every single report." He set the papers down. "You said Crow's name. Has anyone confirmed this man actually exists?" "That's what I need to find out," she said. "The Territorial Survey Office in Helena would have licensing records. Every geological surveyor operating in Montana Territory has to be licensed and registered. If Silas Crow is a real person, he's in those records. If he isn't, then someone made him up," Gideon said, "and used a fictional expert to make fictional mineral surveys look official enough to manipulate land values and bank decisions." She paused. "Which means every financial action taken against these families, the recalled loans, the collapsed contracts, was based on fraudulent documentation." Gideon was very still. "I need someone to go to Helena and check those licensing records," she said. "I'll send a wire today," he said. "I know a man at the territorial office. We went to school together 30 years ago. If Crow's name isn't in the registry, he'll tell me." He sent the wire. They waited. The fire started 11 days later, on a dry Tuesday evening when the wind had been coming from the southwest all day and hadn't let up by nightfall. Mara smelled it first. Not smoke exactly, but the shift in the air that comes just before smoke. The particular dryness and heat that the nose learns to recognize as warning if you've lived rural long enough. She'd been in the kitchen when she caught it, and she was out the back door and across the yard before she'd consciously decided to move, and she could see it from there. The hay barn, the far end of it, orange light moving along the base of the east wall like something alive and very certain of itself. She ran back to the house and hit the iron triangle on the porch post with the heel of her hand, 3 hard strikes, the emergency signal she'd learned from Gideon in her first week. And then she was running toward the barn because the hands would come from the bunkhouse. But it would take them a minute, and a minute was a long time when a hay barn caught. The hands poured out of the bunkhouse, still pulling on boots, and Gideon came from the direction of the far fence line at a flat run, and someone shouted for the water wagon, and for about 30 seconds it was organized chaos with a clear purpose, and then everything went wrong at once. Caleb had been in the loft. He'd been up there doing inventory. She'd asked him that morning to count the remaining baled hay so she could give Gideon an accurate number for the feed order. And he was up there when the fire started at the base of the wall below him, and by the time anyone knew he was in there, the ladder he'd used to get up was already burning at its base, and the smoke was thick enough coming through the floor slats that they could hear him coughing before they could see the shape of him against the loft opening. He was calling out but not panicking, which meant he was still thinking, and she registered that about him even in the middle of everything. That Caleb under pressure was not the boy who flinched when Durst said something cutting. That whatever was soft about him on the outside had something steadier running underneath it. Gideon didn't stop moving. He grabbed the long hay hook from the barn wall, the one side that wasn't yet burning, dragged the water trough over by himself, muscle and leverage, and sheer refusal to waste a second looking for help, and used the hook to pull down enough of the burning ladder base that he could get a boot purchase on what remained. He went up that ladder the way men go up things when they've stopped calculating the risk, and someone below was throwing water on the wall, and Mara grabbed a wet feed sack and beat at the base of the flames because it was the only useful thing she could do from where she was standing. They got Caleb down. Gideon came out of the loft opening with the young man half over his shoulder, descended the wreckage of the ladder by feel more than sight with smoke pouring around both of them, and when he hit the ground he staggered. She saw it. The half-step sideways that men make when they've pushed past what the body can cleanly sustain, and then steadied, and walked Caleb away from the building and sat him on the ground 30 feet clear of the heat. Caleb was coughing hard and his eyes were streaming and his hands were shaking, but he was sitting up on his own. Gideon crouched in front of him. "Can you breathe?" "Yes, sir." Cough. "I'm sorry, I should have—" "You're breathing," Gideon said. "That's all that matters right now." He stood up and looked at the barn. Half of it was going to be a loss. The east wall and the loft were gone. The hands had gotten enough water on the west section to save it, barely, and the fire was dying now for lack of fuel at the base. But the hay was gone. All of it. Every bale Caleb had been counting. And the smell was the specific thick smell of a hay fire, which sits in the throat and doesn't leave. Mara was standing next to Gideon. She hadn't planned to be. She'd moved there without deciding to, the way you move toward the nearest solid thing when the ground feels uncertain. "This wasn't an accident," she said, quietly enough that only he could hear. "No," he said, "the base of the east wall. Someone set it there deliberately. Hay doesn't spontaneously ignite at the base of an exterior wall on a night with no lightning." He was looking at what was left of the barn. His face in the firelight was something she hadn't seen from him before. Not the controlled, compressed anger of the letters and the cut fence, but something rawer, something that had gotten past the compression. "Caleb was in there," he said. "I know. Whoever set this fire either didn't know there was a person in that loft." He stopped. "Or didn't care," she said. The words sat in the smoky air between them. She became aware in that moment of how close they were standing. Close enough that she could feel the heat coming off his shirt, from the fire, from the effort, from whatever was running through him right now that he was working very hard to contain. She could see the burn on the back of his left hand where he'd caught the ladder, a wide red mark that he hadn't said anything about and probably wouldn't. She thought, I could have watched him not come out of that barn. The thought arrived fully formed and completely unwelcome, like a door opening onto a room she hadn't known was there. She took one step back. "Your hand needs to be cleaned," she said. He looked down at it like he'd forgotten about it. "It's fine." "It's not fine," she said. "Come inside when you're done out here." She walked back to the house. She walked back to the house because she needed 30 seconds to be somewhere that wasn't standing next to Gideon Rourke in firelight, thinking about how he'd gone up that burning ladder without a single moment of calculation, and how that was either the bravest or the most reckless thing she'd seen a person do in recent memory, and how she wasn't entirely sure those were different things. She filled a basin with water and set out the clean cloth and the salve she kept in the kitchen cupboard, and she stood at the work table and breathed carefully for a while. And then she heard the back door and composed herself, and when he came in she cleaned his hand without making more of it than it was, and he sat across the table and let her, which said something too. that he'd stopped, at some point in the past weeks, flinching away from the ordinary human business of being cared for. "The wire from Helena came back this afternoon," he said. She looked up at him. "My contact at the territorial office checked the licensing registry for the past 10 years. He paused. "There is no surveyor named Silas Crow." The cloth went still in her hands. "There has never been a licensed geological surveyor by that name in Montana Territory," he continued. "The name appears nowhere in any official record." She sat down. Not dramatically. She just needed to be sitting. "All 5 surveys," she said. "Worthless." "More than worthless," Gideon said. "Fabricated. Filed under a false name, used to manipulate bank assessments and investor interest, and then the property owners were systematically destabilized through financial pressure and sabotage until they were willing to sell at whatever Blackridge offered." He looked at her. "You found it." "We haven't proven it yet," she said. "We have parallel documents and a missing name in a registry. That's a thread, not a case. It's enough to go to a territorial judge. It's enough to make an accusation," she said carefully. "A man with Blackridge's money and connections will have lawyers who can create enough confusion around unverified documents and circumstantial timelines that a judge dismisses it pending further inquiry." She straightened the papers on the table, not because they needed it, but because she needed something to do with her hands. "We need the families. We need all of them to come forward together, with their records, and we need to make a case that's too large and too coordinated to explain away as coincidence or personal grievance." Gideon was quiet. "You want to bring them here," he said. "I want to bring them here," she confirmed, quietly. "Not in a way that signals anything to Blackridge before we're ready. Just neighbors visiting a neighbor, people comparing notes." She looked at him. "You'd have to be the one to invite them. They trust you. You're the one with land they respect and a name that means something in this territory. And you think they'll come." "Clara Foss drove herself 12 miles to sit in my kitchen," she said. "She came. People come when they understand that someone else has seen what they've been carrying alone." He looked at the table for a long moment. "This is not the kind of thing I do," he said. I haven't had people in this house in a long time." She understood what he meant, not logistically. The table in the kitchen could seat 14 people if they pulled in the chairs from the dining room. He wasn't talking about chairs. "I know," she said quietly. "Margaret used to—" He stopped, started again. "She used to have the neighbors over, not for any particular reason, just because she thought people needed to see each other regularly, or they forgot how to be around each other." A pause. "I stopped doing that after." "You stopped doing most things after," Mara said, not unkindly, just as a fact they both already knew. He looked at her. "You've been watching me for 2 months," he said. It wasn't accusatory. "You're not hard to watch," she said. "You're very consistent." Something moved across his face that was almost a smile. It didn't quite make it, but it was the closest she'd seen him get. "I'll write the letters tonight," he said. "Potem." The letters went out the next morning by courier, and the responses came back over the following 4 days. All of them, yes, all of them careful and quiet and understood to be not for public knowledge. And on the second Saturday of September, 5 families came to Ironwood Ranch and sat down at a table that had been empty for 7 years. Mara had cooked for 2 days straight. Not because she was nervous, but that wasn't the reason. She cooked because feeding people was the most direct thing she knew how to do, and these people needed something direct. They'd been frightened and isolated, and they were coming into a stranger's house with their most private financial documents in hand, trusting that whatever they were going to find here was worth the exposure of bringing it. The least she could do was make sure they didn't sit down hungry. There were 11 people put in the sitting room with blankets and food and instructions to stay put. Aldous Webb and his wife. Clara Foss and her husband Ned, who was a large, quiet man who reminded Mara somewhat of Thomas, which made her like him immediately. The Hartleys, Owen and his mother, who was 81 years old and had been running the Hartley land single-handedly since Owen's father died, and who sat at the table with a backbone like a fence post and said almost nothing but watched everything. Preston Cole, the widower from 12 miles north, who had driven alone in a wagon that needed new wheel spokes and apologized to no one for it. And Gideon, at the head of his own table, in his own home, with more people in it than had been there in 7 years. Mara watched him when he thought she wasn't watching. He was uncomfortable. Anyone who knew him well enough, and she was startled sometimes by how well she was coming to know him, could see it in the set of his shoulders and the slight stiffness of how he held himself, the way a man holds himself when the world has come in closer than he's used to. But he wasn't retreating. He stayed at the table. He listened. When people spoke, he looked at them directly and responded directly, and she could see the other families responding to that, to the fact that Gideon Rourke, who had a reputation for closed gates and distant manners, was sitting at his own table being straightforwardly present. It was, she thought, harder for him than anything he'd done in a long time. She brought out the documents. She'd organized everything she had over the past weeks into a sequence that told the story cleanly. The 5 surveys, the identical language, the missing name in the territorial registry, the timeline of Blackridge's purchase offers followed, almost immediately in each case, by the specific form of financial pressure that most effectively targeted each individual family. The Fosses recalled bank loan. The Hartleys, a neighboring fence dispute that had somehow cost them access to their eastern water source. Aldous Webb, the contaminated tributary. Preston Cole, 3 consecutive contracts that had fallen through in ways that left him cash poor heading into winter. She laid it out in order and walked them through it. The room was very quiet. Ned Foss said halfway through, "How did you know to look for all of this?" "I ran a farm's accounts for 8 years," she said. "When numbers don't make sense, you look for the thing you're not supposed to see." Owen Hartley said, "And this crow, you're certain he doesn't exist?" "The Territorial Licensing Office has no record of him. We can verify that in writing from the Registrar's office if you need it for evidence." "I need it for my own peace of mind," Owen said, and his mother, who had said nothing for 40 minutes, made a sound that was not quite a laugh but functioned as one. They talked for 3 hours. By the time they were done, the children had fallen asleep in the sitting room, and the coffee had been refilled twice, and the table had the comfortable disorder of a place where people have actually been present. Cups left where they'd been set, papers slightly rearranged, crumbs that nobody had been self-conscious about. At the end of it, Gideon said, "I think we take what we have to the territorial court. Together. All of us, with our records and Mara's analysis and the registration response from Helena." "Blackridge will fight it," Preston Cole said. "He'll fight it harder if we go separately," Mara said. "He'll fight each of us alone, and he has the resources to win that way. Together, we're not 5 individual complaints. We're a pattern, and patterns are very hard to explain away." Mrs. Hartley set her coffee cup down. "When do we go?" And that was it. No more discussion. The 81-year-old woman with the backbone like a fence post had made the decision for all of them the way certain people make decisions. Not by forcing it, but by stating it so simply and with such complete certainty that everyone else recognized they'd already reached the same conclusion and had just been waiting for someone to say it. Blackridge's man came 2 days later, not Blackridge himself. A hired rider, one of 3, who came to the gate at Ironwood in the late afternoon and asked for Gideon Rourke. Gideon was in the yard. He walked to the gate himself, which meant Mara saw the whole thing from the kitchen window. She had a clear line of sight, and she stood at the window with her hands still in the bread dough and watched. She couldn't hear what was said. She could see how Gideon stood, feet planted, weight settled, completely motionless, the way he went still when something required him to be very controlled. She could see the rider talking, watched him reach into his coat and produce a folded document, watched Gideon take it with one hand and not look at it, keeping his eyes on the rider's face. The rider left. Gideon walked back to the house. He handed the document to Mara without preamble. It was a legal notice. Blackridge's lawyers in Helena were filing a criminal complaint against Gideon for allegedly organizing an unlawful armed assembly against a legitimate business representative, referencing the night the riders had come to Ironwood and Gideon and the hands had driven them off, and against Mara Bellamy for fabricating and circulating fraudulent documents designed to interfere with legitimate business contracts. She read it twice. Her hands were steady, her chest was not. "He found out about the meeting," she said. "Someone talked," Gideon said, "or someone watched." She set the document on the table. "He's trying to get ahead of us. File charges before we can file anything, put us on defense, make the court spend its time on us instead of on him." "If this goes forward, you could be arrested," Gideon said. His voice was very even. Held pending a hearing. I know, Mara. She looked at him. His face had done the thing it rarely did. It had let something through. Not the controlled anger, not the compressed grief, but actual fear, the plain ordinary humankind, sitting on his face in the afternoon kitchen light without any attempt at concealment. I know, she said again, more quietly. We don't have to. Yes, we do, she said. If we stop now, he wins. And if he wins, those families lose their land. Clara Foss loses the farm she's worked for 20 years. The Hartleys lose the land that woman has kept alive since her husband died. She looked at him steadily. And you lose Ironwood. And I lose. She stopped. What? He said. And the word was careful and quiet and waiting. She looked at the table, at the legal document, at the evidence she'd spent 2 months building in the hours after supper when the house was quiet and she was the only one still awake. I lose the first place I've felt like myself in 2 years, she said. And she hadn't meant to say it, hadn't planned to, and the honesty of it landed on her with some surprise. The kitchen was very quiet. Then we go to the Capitol, Gideon said. She nodded. Together, he said, all of us. We take the evidence, we take the families, and we walk into that courthouse together, and we don't stop. You're still wounded, she said, because 2 nights before the meeting, 5 days after the fire, the writers had come, and in the confusion and the dark, one of them had put a bullet through Gideon's left shoulder, not deeply, not vitally, but enough that he had the bandage under his shirt and had been moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who was not going to acknowledge how much it hurt. I can ride with one good shoulder, he said. Gideon, I can ride, he said again. Not defensive, just facts. She looked at him for a long moment. I know you can, she said. And then, because she was not a woman who made gestures for effect, she reached across the table and put her hand over his, over the burned hand, the left one, the one she'd cleaned the night of the fire. She held it there for just a moment. He looked down at their hands. He didn't move. Margaret used to do that, he said, very quietly. When I was about to do something she thought was dangerous and necessary, and she couldn't talk me out of it. He looked up at her. She'd just hold on for a minute, and then let go, and not say anything. Mara felt something tighten in her throat. She sounds like she was very smart, she said. She was, he said. The smartest person I've ever known. He paused. Until recently. She let go of his hand. She stood up and picked up the legal document and carried it to the cupboard where she kept the evidence files and put it with the rest. One more piece of paper in the case against Silas Blackridge, and now the most urgent one. I need to write to the other families tonight, she said. They need to know what he's filed, and they need to decide if they're still coming. They'll come, Gideon said. You don't know that. I watched them around that table, he said. Mrs. Hartley asked when. She didn't ask if. He pushed back from the table and stood, and she could see the shoulder in the way he rose, the slight stiffness, the careful management. Write the letters. I'll have them sent at first light. He went to the door. Gideon, she said. He stopped. What you did that night, she said. The ladder. Going up there for Caleb. She stopped, finding the right words. I've known a lot of men in my life, good men. My husband was a good man, but I have not met very many men who move toward the thing they're afraid of without stopping to calculate what it's going to cost them. He was very still. I wasn't afraid, he said. Yes, you were, she said. That's exactly the point. He was quiet for a long moment. Caleb is a good kid, he said finally. He just needed someone to tell him so. He went out. Mara sat at the table and pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her and uncapped the ink and wrote the first letter, to Clara and Ned Foss. And as she wrote, she could hear from somewhere above her the sound of Gideon's footsteps crossing the upper hallway. They stopped. As they had stopped before, at the same place. She knew without looking what door they had stopped in front of. She kept writing. Above her, the footsteps stayed where they were for almost a full minute, longer than they had any other night. And then, very slowly, she heard something she had not heard in all the weeks she had been in Ironwood Ranch. Not the footsteps walking away. Not the creak of the floorboard that meant he'd gone back to his room. The sound, so small she almost wasn't sure she'd heard it, of a key turning in a lock. She stopped writing. She sat completely still and listened. She heard the door open, then silence. Then, after a long time, she heard it close again, gently, not locked this time, just resting in its frame. Then the footsteps moved away down the hall. She sat at the kitchen table with the unfinished letter in front of her and the ink drying on the pen and thought about a man who had spent 7 years unable to open a door and what it meant that tonight, in the middle of all of this, the legal threats and the wounded shoulder and the families depending on him and the ride to the capital that was coming, he had finally been able to turn the key. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the small photograph in her room, wrapped in the handkerchief. She thought about the fact that grief didn't end. It didn't close up and seal over and stop mattering. It just gradually, slowly, made enough room for other things. She picked up the pen. She finished the letter. Outside, the Montana night was cold and clear and very large, and somewhere in the distance, a light burned in the Foss farmhouse, where Clara was almost certainly still awake, waiting for exactly this. Mara folded the letter and reached for the next sheet of paper, and she kept writing until every family had a letter, and the lamp burned late in the Ironwood kitchen, and for the first time since she had walked 4 miles through July heat to knock on a stranger's door, she understood that what she had been building here was not just a case against Silas Blackridge. It was something she hadn't had a word for yet, but she was beginning to find one. All 5 families wrote back within 3 days. Every one of them said yes. Clara Foss's letter was the longest, 2 full pages in her careful schoolteacher's hand, detailing additional records she'd found since the meeting. A second set of correspondence between the Helena Bank and an investment firm whose letterhead she'd never recognized, but which now, reading it again with what she knew, looked like it might be connected to Blackridge's Eastern operation. She'd included the letters in the envelope, folded small, with a note at the bottom that said simply, "We're coming, all of us. Don't let him win." Preston Cole's response was 4 words on a torn scrap of paper. "I'll be there. Cole." Mrs. Hartley didn't write at all. Owen wrote on her behalf and said his mother had told him not to waste ink on the obvious. Gideon read them at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning with his coffee going cold beside him, and when he finished the last one, he put them all in a neat stack and didn't say anything for a moment. "When do we leave?" he asked. "Monday," Mara said. "That gives us 4 days to organize the documents, arrange the wagon, and send word ahead to the courthouse requesting an emergency hearing before Judge Lockwood." "You know Lockwood's name?" "I asked Preston Cole when he stopped by yesterday. He said Lockwood has a reputation for not being owned by anyone with money." She poured fresh coffee into his cup without asking. "That's the kind of judge we need." Gideon looked at the stack of letters. "Blackridge will have filed his complaint already. We'll be walking into a courthouse where there are active charges against both of us." "I know. If Lockwood decides to hear his case first, then we make sure our case is already in the record before we get there," she said. "I'm sending a written summary of our evidence to the courthouse today, separate from the hearing request. Just a filing. It creates a paper record that exists independent of whatever Blackridge's lawyers put in front of the judge." He looked at her. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "I've been thinking about this since the second anonymous letter," she said. "The one about Thomas." His jaw tightened. She'd noticed that it always did when Thomas's name came up in connection with Blackridge. That particular tightening that was something other than sympathy, but functioned like it. "I want to see him in that courtroom," she said. It came out quieter than she'd intended, and more honest. "I want to sit across a room from that man and watch his story fall apart in front of people who are paying attention." "He'll have lawyers who are very good at keeping stories from falling apart," Gideon said. "I know," she said. "I also know what's in those 5 survey reports, and I know every line of the financial timeline I've built, and I know exactly where his fabrication breaks down." She sat down across from him. "I'm not afraid of his lawyers." He studied her face for a moment with those pale gray eyes that she had, somewhere in the past 3 months, stopped finding unreadable. "I know you're not," he said. "That's the part that worries me." She raised an eyebrow. "People who aren't afraid of things," he said, "sometimes underestimate what those things are willing to do." She thought about the fire, about Caleb's face at the loft opening, about the bullet that had gone through Gideon's shoulder in the dark. "I'm not underestimating him," she said. "I'm just not letting him be larger than he is." The 4 days before departure were the most exhausting of Mara's life, and her life had contained several strong contenders for that title. She organized the evidence into a single document, a formal written analysis, 31 pages, that laid out the fabricated surveys, the identical language across reports, the missing surveyor's name, the timeline of purchase offers and financial attacks, and the documented sabotage at Ironwood Ranch. She wrote it the way Thomas had taught her to keep accounts. Clear, sequential, no word wasted. Every claim supported by the specific document it came from, every document identified by source and date. She wrote it in her own name. She signed it. If Blackridge wanted to accuse her of fabricating evidence, she was going to make sure every piece of that evidence was traceable, sourced, and clearly laid out for any judge who cared to read it. Gideon read the finished document on Sunday evening. He read all 31 pages without stopping. When he finished, he put it down and sat with his hand resting on the last page and said, "My lawyer in Helena, a man named Forsyth. I'm going to wire him tonight and have him meet us at the courthouse Monday afternoon." "Good. He's going to want to read this. That's why I wrote it, so anyone could understand it," she said. "Mara." He said her name in the way he'd developed of saying it that meant something specific. Not a question, not a command, just a way of making sure she was looking at him before he said the next thing. "Whatever happens in that courtroom, if it goes badly, if Lockwood rules against us on some procedural matter, if Blackridge's lawyers find a way to delay, I want you to know that I have resources enough to fight this longer than he expects." She shook her head. "I know you do," she said. "But that's not the kind of fight I want to win. If we win because you can afford more lawyers than he can, that's not justice. It's just money beating money." She looked at the document on the table between them. "I want to win because what's in those 31 pages is true and provable, and the kind of thing that a person in a position of authority cannot in good conscience ignore." He was quiet. "You still believe that exists," he said, "the thing that can't be ignored." "I believe it can be made to exist," she said, "which is different. It doesn't happen on its own. You have to build it carefully enough that ignoring it becomes harder than addressing it." He looked at her for a long moment. "My father would have liked you," he said. "You said that before, about Margaret." "I know," he said. "I'm saying it again. Different person, same observation." He picked up the document and held it. "My father built this ranch from nothing. He used to say that the only thing that made land yours was the willingness to defend it in public. He meant it about property law. I think he also meant it about everything else." She thought about Thomas, about the farm that hadn't been saved, the land that had gone to creditors, the morning she'd stood in the yard with the broken suitcase and understood there was nothing left to defend because she'd been alone in the defending. "He was right," she said. They left Monday at first light, all 5 families, in a loose convoy along the road norths, wagons and horses, and, in Mrs. Hartley's case, a black buggy that was at least 20 years old and had been polished to within an inch of its life for the occasion. The old woman sat in it ramrod straight with Owen beside her and her late husband's surveying records in a leather case on her lap, and she looked like someone going to a funeral who had every intention of outlasting it. Mara rode in the wagon with Gideon. She'd expected him to ride on horseback. It was how he usually traveled. But his shoulder was still limiting, and the wagon gave her room to keep the document case safely flat and organized. He drove without complaint and didn't mention the shoulder, which meant it was hurting more than he wanted to say. She'd changed the dressing that morning before they left, and had said nothing about what she saw, because he hadn't asked, and there were some things a person needed to be allowed to carry quietly. Caleb rode behind them. He'd asked to come 3 days earlier, standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, and said simply that he wanted to be useful, and that if there was something he could do at the Capitol, watching the horses, carrying the boxes, being another body on their side of the room, he wanted to be there. Gideon had said yes without hesitation, which had done something visible to Caleb's face. The road to the Capitol was a day and a half's journey. They camped the first night in a broad, flat clearing off the road, all 5 families together around a shared fire, and Mara cooked over it. A simple thing, beans and salt pork and the bread she'd baked the previous afternoon. But people ate it the way people eat when they're nervous, and a shared meal is the best available substitute for certainty. Clara Foss sat beside her while she cooked, and they didn't talk about the courthouse or the hearing. Clara talked about her garden, about a particular variety of bean. She'd been trying to grow for 3 years that kept failing, about how she'd finally gotten it right this past summer, and then not had the heart to eat very many of them because it felt like a waste to consume something it had taken so long to learn. "Save the seeds," Mara said. "I did," Clara said. "I always save the seeds." Around the fire, Ned Foss and Owen Hartley and Gideon were talking in low voices about land and water rights, and the specific legal structures Blackridge had likely used to leverage the bank relationships. Preston Cole had fallen asleep sitting up against a wagon wheel, which somehow managed to look dignified. Mrs. Hartley was awake and watching the fire and not talking to anyone, which was, Mara had come to understand, simply how she existed, fully present, entirely self-contained, needing nothing from the room but taking in everything. Mara looked across the fire at Gideon. He was talking to Ned Foss, leaning slightly forward, gesturing with his good hand to illustrate something. And in the firelight, with the tightness around his eyes from the shoulder and the road and the weight of all of it, he looked, not younger exactly, but more present than she'd seen him, more in the world. He caught her looking. She looked back at the fire. She heard him, a minute later, finish whatever he was saying to Ned, and then he came and sat down next to her on the near side of the fire, close enough that she could feel his shoulder almost touching hers. And he didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything. And Clara tactfully found something to do on the other side of the wagon, and they sat in the particular quiet of two people who have run out of the need to fill silence with anything other than the fact of being present in the same place. "Are you afraid?" he asked after a while. She thought about it honestly. Of losing? Of any of it. She looked at the fire. "I'm afraid of going back to where I was," she said. "Before Ironwood. Not the poverty, specifically. I can survive that. I've proven it. I mean," she paused, finding it, "the aloneness of it. The sense that whatever happened next wasn't going to happen to anyone who cared." She looked at the fire another moment. "I hadn't realized how much of that I'd been carrying until I was somewhere it wasn't true anymore." He was quiet. "I'm afraid of the shoulder," he said. She looked at him. "I've been—" He stopped, recalibrated. "The last time I was in a situation where the outcome was uncertain and I had something to lose, I lost it." He said it without drama, without the invitation to sympathy that men sometimes use when they say things like that, just as a fact. "It's harder to go back into uncertainty when you know what uncertainty costs." "That's not fear," she said. "That's experience. It feels the same from the inside." "I know," she said. "But one of them is useful and one of them isn't, and knowing which is—" She paused. "It's what gets you back on the ladder." He turned and looked at her. "Mara," he said. And he said it differently than he'd said it before. Not the particular way that meant I need you to be looking at me, but something older and quieter and considerably more exposed than that. She met his eyes. "When this is over," he said. She waited. "I don't want it to go back to how it was," he said. "The kitchen, the meals, I don't want it to go back to how Ironwood was before you came." Her heart did something inconvenient. "We should get through the courthouse first," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm just saying it, so it's said." She nodded slowly. "It's said," she confirmed. He nodded once and looked back at the fire, and they sat there until the fire burned lower and the camp went quiet, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and also, somehow, not ordinary at all. They reached the capital the following afternoon. It was larger than Dry Creek Crossing in the way that all territorial capitals were larger than the towns feeding them. More noise, more horses, more people moving with the purposeful self-importance of people who believed they were somewhere that mattered. The courthouse was a stone building on the main street, 2 stories, with the territory's seal above the entrance and a board outside listing the day's docket. Blackridge's complaint was on it. Mara read it without expression and went inside. Gideon's lawyer, Forsyth, was waiting in the lobby, a compact man in his 50s with a precise gray beard and the watchful eyes of someone who had spent decades in rooms where things were decided and had learned to pay attention to the things people said with their bodies rather than their mouths. He shook Gideon's hand and looked at Mara with frank assessment and said, "You're the one who wrote the analysis." "Yes." "I read the copy Gideon sent ahead." He paused. "It's good work." "Can we use it?" "If Lockwood will hear the counterfiling today, yes. He's agreed to an emergency session this afternoon. Both complaints heard together. Blackridge's lawyers are already in the building. He glanced toward the hallway. There are 4 of them. How many do we have? Preston Cole asked, from behind Mara. 1, Forsyth said. But I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've read that analysis twice, and I think 4 might not be enough for what he's walking into. The courtroom was not large. It fit everyone. The 5 families in the gallery benches, Blackridge's legal team arrayed at one table with Blackridge himself at the end of it, Forsyth and Gideon and Mara at the other. Judge Abram Lockwood was a narrow man, perhaps 65, with silver hair and a stillness about him that Mara recognized as the particular stillness of someone who had seen every variety of human manipulation and was not interested in any of them. She recognized it because it was similar to the stillness she'd been cultivating herself for 34 years. Blackridge sat at his table the way he'd arrived at Ironwood that first day, composed, polished, utterly comfortable with the room and what it meant that he was in it. He was wearing a dark coat and had a watch chain that caught the light. He looked at Gideon briefly and then looked at Mara and held the look for just a beat too long. Not threatening, but establishing something. A reminder that he had named her specifically in his filing. She looked back at him without adjusting anything in her expression. He looked away first. Lockwood opened the session by having both complaints read into the record, which took 20 minutes. Blackridge's filing was long and elaborately structured. The unlawful assembly charge against Gideon for gathering the ranchers, the document fabrication charge against Mara, a separate civil claim for interference with legitimate business operations. It was designed to be heavy, to make the opposing table look buried. Blackridge's lead attorney, a tall man named Carver, who had the fluid, practiced delivery of someone who'd argued many things he hadn't believed, rose first and presented the complaint with the elegant precision of someone arranging furniture. He made Gideon sound like a dangerous radical, and Mara sound like a con artist who had attached herself to a grieving widower and used forged documents to destroy a legitimate investor's business relationships. He used the word widow 3 times in the first 5 minutes. Each time, Mara wrote something on the notepad in front of her. Forsyth let him finish. Then he rose and said calmly, "Your Honor, we'd like to submit a counterfiling and request that the court examine the counter-evidence before ruling on the original complaint." Lockwood looked at the stack of documents Forsyth placed before him. He looked at the thickness of the stack. He said, "How much of this is relevant to the specific complaints before me?" "All of it," Forsyth said. "The counter-evidence doesn't just address the complaints. It establishes that the complaints themselves are part of an ongoing pattern of fraudulent business activity directed against the families present in this gallery." Lockwood looked at the gallery, at the Fosses, the Hartleys, Preston Cole, Aldous Webb, and his wife. He looked at Mrs. Hartley, who sat with her husband's surveying records on her lap and her spine straight as a post, and who met his gaze with complete equanimity. "Proceed," Lockwood said. Forsyth handled the legal architecture, but it was Mara who built the case itself. Lockwood allowed her to present the analysis directly, treating her as what she was, the person who had assembled the evidence and therefore the person best equipped to explain it. Blackridge's lawyers objected twice. Both times Lockwood overruled them with the flat efficiency of a man who did not enjoy having his time managed for him. She stood at the front of the courtroom with the 31-page document and walked through it the same way she'd walked through it at the kitchen table in Ironwood, clearly, sequentially, with no word wasted. She showed the 5 survey reports side by side and read the identical passages aloud. She showed the Territorial Licensing Registry response, confirming that Silas Crow had never been licensed as a surveyor in Montana Territory. She showed the timeline, purchase offer, refusal, financial attack, in every single case, a gap of less than 3 weeks between Blackridge's offer being declined and the first form of economic pressure materializing. She showed the bank correspondence that Clara Foss had found, the letters between the Helena Bank and an Eastern investment firm, and the investment firm's name, which Forsyth had spent the overnight hours in the Capitol tracing to a holding company whose registered agent was, ultimately, Silas Blackridge. The courtroom was very quiet. Carver rose. "Your Honor, these documents are presented without chain of custody. Every document in this analysis," Mara said, turning to face him, "is identified by source, date, and the name of the person from whose records it was obtained. Every person from whose records these documents came is sitting in that gallery and can be called to confirm their provenance. Lockwood looked at Carver. Carver sat down. Then the families testified. Aldous Webb described the contaminated tributary and the timeline of Blackridge's visit. Clara Foss described the bank loan recall, 11 years of perfect standing erased inside 30 days. Owen Hartley described the fence dispute that had cut his mother's access to their eastern water. Preston Cole described the contracts one by one and the specific way each had failed, and the name that kept appearing in the background of each failure when he traced it. Then Gideon took the stand. He was still in the shirt he'd traveled in, with the bandaged shoulder visible at the collar, and he sat in the witness chair the way he stood in his barn doorway, settled, not performing anything. He described Blackridge's visits. He described the letters, the cut fences, the cattle, the lost contract. He described the night the riders came to Ironwood and the shot that went through his shoulder and the fact that one of those riders, when Webb had pulled him off his horse in the dark, had been carrying a written order on letterhead that Forsyth now produced for the court. The letterhead belonged to a property management firm registered in New York. The property management firm's sole director was listed in the New York Commercial Registry as one Silas Blackridge. Carver rose again. He was still smooth, still controlled, but there was something different underneath it now. The quality of a man working harder than he'd expected to work. Your Honor, my client denies any connection between these incidents and legitimate business activities. Mr. Carver, Lockwood said, I'd like to ask your client a question. Carver paused, sat down. Lockwood looked at Blackridge. Mr. Blackridge, he said, the geological surveys submitted in support of your investment claims to these 5 properties all bear the signature of a licensed surveyor named Silas Crow. I have before me a certified response from the Territorial Licensing Office stating that no such person exists in their records. Can you produce Mr. Crow or any documentation of his licensing? Blackridge's face did not change visibly, but something in the room changed. My legal team will require time to, Carver began. I'm asking your client, Lockwood said. Blackridge looked at the judge. The surveyor operated under the supervision of, Can you produce him, Lockwood said, or documentation of his licensing, yes or no? A pause that lasted long enough to mean everything. No, Blackridge said. The word fell into the courtroom and didn't bounce. Lockwood recessed for 40 minutes. In the corridor outside, the 5 families stood together in the way people stand when they're trying not to show how badly they need a particular outcome. Clara Foss was holding Ned's hand. Owen Hartley stood next to his mother, who was seated on a bench and had not yet changed her expression from the one she'd had going in. Preston Cole was looking at a painting on the wall with great apparent interest in something that had nothing to do with the painting. Caleb was standing near the window. Mara went and stood beside him. You doing all right? She asked. Yes, ma'am. He paused. I kept thinking about the barn, about being up there and the smoke coming through the floor, and thinking, he stopped. What? Thinking that I was glad I'd done the inventory when you asked me to, he said. That I'd done something useful before. He stopped again, swallowed. Mr. Rourke came up that ladder without... He didn't even slow down. No, she said. He didn't. Why would he do that for me? She looked at the young man, the boy who flinched when Durst said something cutting, who'd been invisible at the far end of a table until someone bothered to look at him. Because you matter to him, she said. You matter to the ranch. And he's the kind of man who goes toward things that matter to him, even when it costs him. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He's different than he used to be, he said. I've worked here 3 years and I've never... He used to not come to meals. He used to walk through the yard and not look at anyone. He searched for the word. He's here now. He wasn't before. Mara looked at the courtroom door. People come back, she said, when someone gives them a reason. Caleb looked at her with the directness of the very young, who haven't yet learned to disguise what they understand. He loves you, he said, plainly, as a fact. She didn't answer, but she didn't disagree. The courtroom door opened. Lockwood had returned. The ruling took 12 minutes to deliver, which was fast enough that Blackridge's lead attorney looked, for the first time, genuinely uncertain. Lockwood dismissed every charge against Mara, the fabrication accusation, the interference claim. with the specific finding that the evidence demonstrated not fabrication, but accurate documentation of fraudulent activity. He said the word fraudulent 4 times in 5 minutes, and each time he said it, he was looking at Blackridge's table. He dismissed the unlawful assembly charge against Gideon with the finding that neighbors gathering to compare records of shared victimization did not constitute criminal conspiracy. He invalidated the geological surveys as official documents, finding them fabricated under a false professional identity and therefore without legal standing in any property or financial determination. He ordered the evidence turned over for criminal investigation, naming fraud, conspiracy to commit financial harm, property sabotage, and the armed attack on Ironwood Ranch. And then he looked over the top of his papers at the gallery, at all 5 families, at the Fosses and the Hartleys and Preston Cole and Aldous Webb and his wife. And he said something that Mara had not expected in a voice that was quiet and entirely without theater. The court notes that this outcome was only possible because these individuals chose to present their grievances collectively and completely. In this court's experience, fraud of this nature succeeds precisely because it isolates its victims. The people in this room today demonstrated that isolation is a choice, and they chose otherwise. He gathered his papers. Court is adjourned. The room exhaled, not cheering. It wasn't that kind of room, and these weren't that kind of people. But the sound that moved through the gallery was something real. The specific release of people who have been carrying a weight for a long time and have just been told they can set it down. Clara Foss put her face in her hands for a moment. Just a moment. Mrs. Hartley reached over and patted her son's knee once, firmly, like punctuating a sentence. Preston Cole turned away from the wall painting he'd been staring at and looked at the room with an expression of considerable, unguarded relief. Mara sat very still at the table. Forsyth was gathering documents beside her, moving with the efficient satisfaction of a man whose work had landed where he'd aimed it. Gideon was still in the witness chair. He hadn't moved since Lockwood had begun the ruling, and he was looking at Mara with an expression she didn't quite have a name for, the kind of look that sits on a person's face when they have arrived somewhere they'd stopped believing they'd reach. She looked back at him. Across the courtroom, Blackridge rose from his table. His lawyers were already moving, the controlled urgency of men calculating next steps, appeals, delays, damage management. Blackridge himself moved differently. He buttoned his jacket with the same deliberate composure with which he'd arrived, and he walked toward the gallery door, and as he passed Mara's table, he stopped. He looked at her. "You're thorough," he said, quietly, without the room hearing. "I'll give you that." She looked at him without expression. "The surveyor's name was a mistake," she said. "You should have used a real one." Something moved in his face. Not anger, something colder than anger. And then he walked out. Carver followed him. Carver followed. The door closed. Gideon came and stood beside her. She became aware suddenly of how tired she was. Not the body tiredness of the road, but the deep, comprehensive tiredness of someone who has been running on urgency and purpose for weeks and has just had both of those things fulfilled. "It's done," he said. "The criminal case isn't done," she said. "He'll be prosecuted and he'll fight that too. But our part is done." She looked at the empty doorway where Blackridge had left. "Our part is done," she confirmed. He stood beside her for a moment, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He reached over and picked up her hand, the right one, the one that had written 31 pages by lamplight in his kitchen, and held it the way she'd held his across the table the night they'd read the legal notice. Just for a moment. Just enough to mean what it meant. She let him. Outside in the corridor, she could hear the families talking, the multiple overlapping voices of people who have been frightened and quiet for a long time and suddenly aren't anymore. And underneath it, the lower sound of the Capitol going about its ordinary business, indifferent and continuous, the way the world always moves around the private turning points of people it doesn't know. Gideon let go of her hand. "Let's go home," he said. And she understood that he meant Ironwood, the ranch with the sealed rooms and the cold dining room and the kitchen table she'd covered in pencil marks and the door upstairs that was no longer locked. And she understood also that he meant it the way a man means it when home has become again a thing worth returning to. "Yes," she said. They went out into the corridor where the families were waiting, and the afternoon light was coming through the courthouse windows in long, slanted bars. And Caleb was standing by the door with the horses, and looked up when he saw them coming with something open and uncomplicated on his face. The road back to Ironwood was a day and a half. It felt shorter than the road in. The road back to Ironwood was quieter than the road in, but it was a different kind of quiet. On the way to the capital, 5 families had traveled with the tight, controlled silence of people conserving themselves for something they weren't sure they could survive. On the way back, the quiet had room in it. People talked when they felt like talking and went silent when they didn't, and neither required explanation. Clara Foss hummed something under her breath for about 20 minutes somewhere in the second hour, stopped when she noticed, and then started again because apparently she'd decided it didn't matter. Mrs. Hartley fell asleep in the buggy somewhere after noon, and Owen drove for 2 hours pretending not to notice, because his mother would have been displeased at being caught sleeping in a moving vehicle, and he was wise enough to let her have the dignity of waking up on her own terms. Preston Cole rode alongside the Ironwood wagon for a stretch of the afternoon and talked to Gideon about water rights and the territorial legislation that had been moving through committee for 2 years without resolution, and Mara sat on the bench beside Gideon and listened and watched the land go past, and felt the particular sensation of a person who has been running very fast for a long time and has finally been given permission to slow down. Her body didn't know what to do with it. Her mind was still moving at the same speed it had been moving for weeks, still pulling threads, still checking the evidence file in her head, still constructing arguments against objections that no longer existed. She caught herself twice mentally composing sentences for Judge Lockwood that didn't need to be composed anymore and had to consciously set them down, the way you set down a bag you've been carrying so long you've stopped noticing the weight. "You're still fighting the case," Gideon said, not looking at her, eyes on the road. "I'm trying not to." "I know. You've had the same expression for the last hour that you had when you were reading Blackridge's filing." She looked at him. "What expression?" "Like you're about 3 sentences ahead of whatever room you're physically in," he said. "It's a very specific look. I've seen it every night at the kitchen table for 2 months." She exhaled. "It'll stop." "It doesn't have to stop immediately," he said. "You built something real. You're allowed to still be inside it for a while." She looked at the road ahead, at the long flat stretch of Montana going gold in the late afternoon, the sky doing what Montana skies did in September, turning colors that had no accurate name, deep and wide and completely indifferent to the small human dramas moving through the land beneath them. "I keep thinking about the letter," she said. "The first anonymous one. The photograph of me outside the bank in Billings." Gideon's hands tightened slightly on the reins. He'd found out about that letter eventually. She'd told him 2 weeks before the Capitol, when the full picture of Blackridge's campaign had become clear enough to include it. He hadn't said much, but his jaw had done the thing it did. "He'd had someone watching you," she said, "before you even hired me. He knew I'd answered the advertisement. He knew what I looked like and where I'd been, and he calculated that the easiest way to destabilize you was to threaten the newest thing in your life." She paused. "He saw me as a vulnerability." "He was wrong," Gideon said. "He wasn't entirely wrong," she said. "He was right that I mattered to the situation. He just had the direction backwards." She watched the road. "He thought I was something that could be used to weaken you. He didn't consider that I might be something that made you harder to break." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "You did," he said simply. "Make me harder to break." She didn't answer. But she didn't look away from the road either, and somewhere in the silence between them, the thing that had been building for months, carefully, imprecisely, at the pace of 2 people who'd both been badly hurt by loss, and were not in any hurry to be careless again, settled into a shape that both of them could feel the edges of without either of them yet saying its name out loud. Preston Cole eventually peeled off toward his own land, tipping his hat. The Webbs and the Fosses turned south at the junction 3 miles before Dry Creek Crossing. Owen Hartley pulled alongside one final time and said, on his mother's behalf, that the Hartley family would be in touch about the alliance, the formal agreement they'd discussed in general terms at the kitchen table, the idea of a mutual protection arrangement between the families, something with actual structure, actual commitments. His mother didn't look up from whatever she was examining in the middle distance, but she raised one finger briefly from her lap, which Owen seemed to understand as confirmation. Then it was just the Ironwood wagon and Caleb on his horse behind it, and the gate coming up ahead with the brand worked into the iron overhead, and the long drive down past the fenced pastures where the cattle were moving in the early evening, the way cattle move when nothing is wrong, slowly, without urgency, the living embodiment of ordinary life continuing. Caleb took the horses. Gideon and Mara walked into the house. It smelled like the house always smelled when it had been closed for a few days. A little stale, a little still, but underneath that the permanent smell of the kitchen, flour and wood smoke, and the dried herbs she'd hung from the ceiling beam 3 weeks after she'd arrived. It smelled like somewhere people lived. She went to the kitchen. She didn't do it consciously. It was just where she went. She stood at the work table and looked at the kitchen and thought about the first time she'd stood in this room. The cold stove, the supplies pushed to the back of the shelves, the smell of a place that had been cleaned but not used. She thought about the sourdough starter she'd built from scratch with the culture Gideon had ordered, which was sitting in its crock on the back shelf and would need feeding tonight. She thought about the pencil marks on the table's wood surface that hadn't quite come out all the way when she'd scrubbed it, faint ghost lines of the document that had brought Silas Blackridge down. She thought about Thomas. She thought about him clearly, without the usual undertow. Not the grief that grabbed, but something quieter. Thomas, who had taught her to keep accounts. Thomas, who had fixed fences in the dark. Thomas, who had died too soon and too fast and left her with $11.40 in a broken suitcase and no one left to ask. She thought, I hope you can see where I ended up. She thought, I think you'd be all right with it. She got the sourdough starter out and began feeding it. Gideon came to the kitchen an hour later. She'd gotten a simple supper going by then. Nothing elaborate, she was tired and the pantry needed restocking, but there was salt pork and eggs and the end of a loaf she'd baked before they left. He sat down at the table without being asked, which he did now as a matter of course, and she set a plate in front of him and sat across from him with her own. They ate. After a while he said, I went upstairs. She looked at him. Before I came down, he said. I went up and I opened Margaret's room again. She waited. I stood in there for a few minutes, he said. Just stood there, looking at it. He was looking at his plate, not at her, the way he looked at things when he was working through something that required more precision than usual. It's the same. Everything exactly the same as she left it. Her brush on the dresser, her book on the nightstand. She was 3/4 through it when she got sick, and she never... He stopped briefly. I've been in that room twice in 7 years. Once to lock it the first week after she died, and then 2 nights ago when I heard you writing downstairs and I thought, I don't know what I thought, that it was time, that something had shifted enough that I could go in there and it would be surviving it rather than drowning in it. Mara set her fork down. Was it? She asked. He thought about it honestly, which she'd come to appreciate about him. He didn't answer questions quickly to fill the space. Mostly, he said. It was hard. It's still hard. But it was survivable, which it wasn't before. He finally looked up at her. I don't think I was capable of it before. Not because I was weak, just because I didn't have enough reason to believe that there was something on the other side of it worth getting to. The kitchen held that. What changed? She asked, though she thought she knew. He looked at her steadily. You know what changed. She did. Gideon, she said. I'm not asking you for anything tonight, he said. I'm not making a declaration and waiting for a response. I just want you to know that what I said on the road wasn't a passing comment. It wasn't gratitude or loneliness talking or anything that has an expiration date. He paused. I haven't been certain about very many things in the past 7 years. I'm certain about this. She looked at him across the table, at the man who had opened his door to a woman with a broken suitcase because she'd walked 4 miles and looked him in the eye, who had gone up a burning ladder without calculating the cost, who had sat at his own dinner table with 11 people for the first time in 7 years and been genuinely present for all of it, who had opened a door last night that he'd kept locked for 7 years and survived what was on the other side of it. He was not a simple man. He was not an easy man. He had sharp edges and long silences and a grief that was going to be part of him for the rest of his life. Not because he was broken, but because loving someone deeply and losing them is not something a person recovers from entirely, and pretending otherwise is just a lie told for other people's comfort. She knew about that. She knew about carrying something permanent inside a life that still had to be lived. I'm certain too, she said. I've been certain for a while. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud until we were on the other side of everything else. He nodded, just once, the way he nodded when something was settled. All right, he said. All right, she said. They finished supper. The first sign that Dry Creek Crossing had reconsidered its position came 3 days after they returned, in the form of Lenora Vane. Mara was in the kitchen garden, the one she'd rehabilitated from neglect over the summer, which was producing more than she'd honestly expected given how late she'd started. When she heard a wagon come down the drive and stop, and then heard voices at the front door, and then heard Gideon's boots on the porch, and then Lenora Vane's voice saying something she couldn't make out from the garden. She stayed in the garden. She wasn't hiding. She was weeding, which needed doing, and she had no particular interest in making anyone's apology easier by presenting herself at the right moment to receive it. If Lenora Vane had something to say, she could say it on her own timeline without Mara arranging herself conveniently. 20 minutes later, Gideon came to the garden. "She wants to speak with you," he said. "I heard her wagon." "She drove out herself," he said. "No driver. She looks like she hasn't slept well." Mara pulled a weed that had been working its way under the bean row for a week. "Did she say what she wants?" "She didn't have to," he said. Her face said it. Mara stood up, pressed her hands against her skirt, and walked to the front of the house. Lenora Vane was standing on the porch. She was a tall woman, perhaps 60, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now something more interesting. A face that had accumulated its years visibly rather than fighting them. She was holding her hat in both hands, which struck Mara immediately as a significant detail, because Lenora Vane did not seem like a woman who held her hat when she could be wearing it. She looked at Mara. Mara looked back. "I owe you an apology," Lenora said. Not a preamble, not a softening, just the thing itself, stated directly, in the voice of a woman who had apparently decided that efficiency was the only option left to her. "Yes," Mara said. "You do." Lenora's jaw worked slightly. She'd expected, Mara could see it, some version of "that's all right" or "don't worry yourself about it," the social lubricant that lets people slide past their own accountability. She hadn't gotten it. "What I said," Lenora said, "and what I let other people say. I repeated things that I treated as obvious without considering that they were cruel. And then when Blackridge's letters started circulating, the ones about your husband, I repeated those too because they seemed to confirm what I'd already decided to believe about you." She stopped. "I didn't know they were fabricated, but I also didn't ask. And I should have asked before I spoke." Mara considered her for a moment. "My husband was a decent man," she said. "He worked himself nearly to death trying to save a farm that couldn't be saved and died before he could know whether he'd managed it. The last thing he needed was his name attached to a lie. And the last thing I needed was to be doing what I was doing, trying to survive, while people who didn't know me used his death as ammunition." She paused. "I accept your apology. I'm not going to tell you it was fine because it wasn't fine, but I accept it." Lenora held her gaze. "That's fair," she said. "It is," Mara agreed. A pause that was not entirely comfortable and was not trying to be. "The news from the capital," Lenora said. "What Blackridge was doing to those families. I didn't know the extent of it." She paused. "I should have been more curious about why a wealthy Eastern businessman was so interested in this particular stretch of Montana territory." "Most people weren't curious," Mara said. "That's how he counted on it working." Lenora looked at the hat in her hands. Is there anything I can do? For any of the families?" Mara thought about Clara Foss and the bean seeds she'd saved and the farm she'd worked for 20 years. She thought about Preston Cole driving alone in a wagon that needed new wheel spokes. She thought about Mrs. Hartley's spine like a fence post and the way she'd sat in that courtroom without needing anyone to tell her she was going to be all right. "Talk to people," Mara said. "Not the way you have been. Differently. You have influence in this town. People listen to you. You said that yourself through Caleb, though you didn't know I was going to hear it. Use that for something better than what you've been using it for." Lenora looked at her for a long moment. "You're not what I expected," she said. "I know," Mara said. "Neither were you." Lenora left 20 minutes later, and Gideon came and stood beside Mara on the porch and watched the wagon go down the drive. "How was that?" he asked. "Uncomfortable," she said. "Necessary." She watched the wagon. "She'll be all right. She's not a bad person. She got comfortable making assumptions, and comfortable people stop noticing what their comfort costs other people." "Is that a general observation or a specific one?" She glanced at him. "Both." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but almost. The formal alliance between the families came together over the following 2 weeks, in the specific, unglamorous way that real things get built. Through correspondence, through arguments about wording, through Preston Cole changing his mind twice about one particular clause, and Owen Hartley's measured patience in talking him back. Gideon hosted 2 more meetings at Ironwood, smaller than the first, more procedural, and Mara fed everyone and stayed in the conversations not as the cook, but as someone whose opinion on the practical mechanics of mutual protection was sought and offered and occasionally argued with, which she found she didn't mind at all. The alliance was formalized on a Thursday afternoon around the kitchen table, signed by 5 families, witnessed by Caleb because he was the only person in the room who hadn't already signed something, and then Mara made dinner and they ate it together in the way people eat when they've finished building something they're not sure they could have built alone. Mrs. Hartley, eating her second helping of the roast chicken, said, "To no one in particular, to everyone in general, this is how it should have been from the beginning, people looking after people." Nobody disagreed. After everyone had gone, and Caleb had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was clean, Gideon asked Mara to walk with him. They walked to the eastern pasture, which was where Ironwood was most itself. The wide flat land with the mountains in the far distance going purple in the early evening, the cattle settled, the fence line that had been cut and restrung and was now whole again and would stay that way. They walked without any particular destination. He said, "I want to ask you something." "All right." Forsyth called it a remarkable piece of analysis, he said. "The document you wrote." That's kind of him. He also said, and he's not a man given to suggestions that aren't practical, that a person with the capacity to build that kind of case from raw records and bank correspondence could find significant work in the territory. Legitimate work, not housekeeping. She looked at him sideways. "I like cooking," she said. "I know you do. That's not the point." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. "I want you to manage Ironwood's accounts, not as an employee, not as a favor or a gesture. I want you to do it because you're better at it than I am, and because this ranch's financial health matters to me, and because having the right person managing those accounts is the difference between a ranch that weathers bad years and one that doesn't." He paused. "I'd also like to still eat your cooking, which is a separate matter." She looked at the pasture. "That's a very practical proposal," she said. "I'm a practical man. You went up a burning ladder without stopping to think about it. That was different." "How?" "That was Caleb," he said simply, as if that explained everything, and somehow it did. She was quiet for a moment. "There's something else," he said. She waited. This time he didn't look at the middle distance or the table or any of the places he looked when he was managing something difficult. He looked directly at her. "I'd like you to stay at Ironwood," he said. "Not as the cook, not as the accountant. As my wife, if you're willing. And if you're not willing yet, if it's too soon or too much or any other reason, I'd rather know that honestly than have you say yes for any reason other than the right one." The evening was very quiet around them. She thought about the first morning at Ironwood, the cold stove and the careful shelves, the way she'd rolled up her sleeves and gotten to work because work was all she had and all she needed. She thought about the night of the fire and standing in firelight thinking about what it would have meant to watch him not come out of that barn. She thought about Thomas, who would have liked Gideon immediately, she thought, in the way that decent men recognize each other without ceremony, and who would have told her without any hesitation to stop carrying the loss like it was all she was allowed to have. She thought about the door upstairs that was no longer locked. "Yes," she said, not with decoration, not with the performance of a woman in a story. Just yes, the way she'd told him she started in an hour on the first day, direct and certain, and not requiring anything more than itself. Something in his face became entirely different from all the versions of his face she had learned over the past months. Not the controlled composure, not the compressed anger, not the careful stillness. Something that had been behind all of those things, waiting, for a very long time. He reached over and took her hand. She let him. They stood in the eastern pasture in the early evening and didn't say anything else for a while because sometimes the most important things have been said, and the silence after them is not emptiness, but its opposite. They married at Ironwood Ranch on the first Saturday of October, when the mornings had gone cold but the afternoons were still warm enough to stand outside without a coat if you didn't stay too long. Clara Foss came with her husband. The Hartleys came, Owen driving his mother in the polished black buggy. Preston Cole came and wore a jacket that had clearly been kept for occasions, and Aldous Webb and his wife brought a jar of the honey they'd been keeping bees for since before Mara had arrived in the territory. Caleb stood near the porch the whole afternoon with the pleased, slightly overwhelmed expression of someone attending the first genuinely happy event he'd been included in for some time. Lenora Vane came. She stood at the edge of things, not presuming, and brought a jar of preserved plums and left them on the kitchen table without making a ceremony of it. Mara saw them there later and said nothing about it, but she put them on the shelf where she kept the things she intended to use. Forsyth sent a letter from the capital that arrived the morning of the wedding, reporting that the territorial prosecutor had formally charged Blackridge on 4 counts: fraud, conspiracy, property sabotage, and directing an armed assault, and that Blackridge's legal team, apparently calculating the odds, had begun discussions about terms. He wouldn't walk away from it entirely, but he wouldn't walk away from it whole either. Mara read the letter at the kitchen table that morning, in the dress she'd pressed the night before, and thought about Blackridge sitting in a room with lawyers discussing what it was going to cost him to have underestimated the wrong people, and felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite relief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. She folded the letter and put it in the document case. The last piece of paper in the case against Silas Blackridge. She put the case in the cupboard. She went to get married. After the families had gone home and the yard had gone quiet, and Caleb had taken himself to the bunkhouse with the tactful efficiency of a young man who understood when to disappear, Gideon took Mara upstairs. Not to their room. They went there later. First, he led her down the hall to the door that had been locked for 7 years and was locked no longer, and he opened it, and they went in together. The room was exactly as he'd described it. The brush on the dresser, the book on the nightstand, 3/4 read and never finished. A quilt on the bed in shades of blue that someone had made by hand, the stitching careful and particular. A pair of boots by the wardrobe that still held the shape of the feet that had worn them. Mara stood in the room and felt the weight of it. Not oppressively, not in the way she'd feared it might feel, but with the simple, honest heaviness of a place that had held a great deal of love and then a great deal of grief, and had not yet been allowed to become anything else. "I don't want to erase her," Gideon said. "I know," Mara said. "I don't want that either." He looked at her. "I want to keep the things that were hers and meant something," he said. "The quilt, some of her books, a few things that should be remembered." He looked around the room. "And I want to let the room be a room again, not a museum, not a sealed place." He paused. "I don't know what's right." "There's no single right," she said. "You keep what you need to keep. You let go of what's ready to be let go, and you don't do any of it on a schedule that someone else sets." He nodded. They stood in Margaret's room for a while, long enough to honor it, not so long that they were holding themselves in the past by force. And then they folded the quilt together, Mara taking one end and Gideon the other, the ordinary physical act of 2 people doing a simple thing that happened also to mean a great deal. And they put it in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed where it would be kept, cared for, not hidden. They left the door open when they went out. Winter came to Ironwood early that year. The first snow fell in November, light and then heavier, settling on the land in the way Montana snow settles, completely, covering everything equally, making the world look simpler than it was. The ranch hands spent the first week of winter making sure everything was tight against the cold. And Caleb, who had grown, over the summer and fall, from the boy who flinched at the far end of the table into someone who walked through the yard with the settled authority of a person who knew what he was doing and why, led the preparation with a competence that surprised no one who'd been paying attention and seemed to surprise only Caleb himself. Gideon gave him an official title, not in a ceremony, not with any kind of announcement. Just said one morning that Caleb would be taking on the primary coordination of the hands going forward and named the wage increase that went with it. And Caleb stood in the barn doorway looking like a man who has just been handed something he'd been reaching for so long he'd stopped expecting to actually reach it. "You've earned it," Gideon said. "You've been earning it since August." Caleb's jaw moved. I'm not sure I know enough yet." Nobody knows enough yet, Gideon said. You learn the rest by doing it. That's always how it works. He walked away, and Caleb stood there for another moment, and Mara, who had been near enough to hear all of it, went back to the kitchen and thought about what it meant to be seen by someone, really seen, accurately, without projection or performance, and how rarely it happened and how much it changed things when it did. The accounts were in better order by winter's end than they'd been in 3 years. Mara had spent October and November going through 5 years of Ironwood's financial records with the same methodical attention she'd given Blackridge's fabricated surveys, and what she'd found was not crisis but accumulated neglect, the financial equivalent of an untended kitchen, nothing catastrophically wrong, just years of things not quite tended to because the person responsible had been too deep in grief to care whether the numbers lined up. She fixed them. Not all at once, and not without a few evenings of Gideon sitting across the table looking at figures that were uncomfortable to look at directly. But she fixed them. And by the time the new year came, Ironwood's position was cleaner than it had been in years. She also started a new sourdough culture. The first one she'd built from the starter Gideon had ordered hadn't survived a mishap in October. She'd let it get too cold during the frantic week before the capital trip, and it had died slowly while she wasn't paying attention. The second one she'd built from scratch the way her mother had taught her, slowly and carefully, feeding it every day without fail, tending it through the cold months. By February, it was producing bread that filled the house with the smells she'd been trying to recreate since she'd had to leave her original culture behind on Thomas's farm. She stood at the work table on a cold February morning with a loaf fresh from the oven and the starter in its crock on the shelf, and thought about continuity, about the things that broke and the things that could be rebuilt from the beginning if you were patient enough and paid attention to what they needed. She thought that was probably true of more than bread. In March, a year, almost exactly, since Thomas had died of a chest infection in the farmhouse she'd had to leave, Mara told Gideon she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, which was where the important conversations at Ironwood always happened, at the table after supper, with the lamp on and the house quiet around them. She told him directly, the way she did things. No lead-up, no softening, just the fact of it stated clearly so that his face could do what it needed to do without her having to manage the moment around him. His face did several things in rapid succession, none of them the ones he would have chosen if he'd had warning. Something broke open in it, briefly. Not grief, not fear, just the overwhelming arrival of something real. His eyes did something she'd only seen once before, the night in the eastern pasture when she'd said yes. He put his hand flat on the table and breathed out slowly. All right, he said. It was, she thought, the most Gideon thing he could possibly have said. All right, she agreed. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the way she'd covered his that night with the legal notice, the way it had become one of the small private languages of their life together. That gesture, that particular covering of one hand with the other, meaning, I am here, I am not going anywhere. Whatever this is, we're doing it together. They sat at the kitchen table for a long time that night, not talking much, in the particular quiet of people who have enough between them that silence doesn't need filling. Their daughter was born in November, during the first real snowfall of that winter. Not dramatically, not in crisis, but not easily either because almost nothing real is easy. And Mara had learned that the distance between a birth and a tragedy was sometimes very small, and you just had to be present and careful and trust the people in the room with you. The people in the room were a doctor from Dry Creek Crossing who turned out to be competent and calm, and Clara Foss, who had driven herself through the snow because Mara had asked her weeks earlier if she would come when the time came, and who sat in the kitchen most of the night making coffee and keeping Gideon from pacing himself into a rut in the floor. He paced anyway. At some point, Clara told him, matter-of-factly, to sit down before he wore through the boards, and he sat down, and she poured him coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table, this table that had held so much already, and waited. And then there was a different sound from upstairs. Gideon was up the stairs before the coffee cup had stopped moving. Mara was exhausted in a way she had no previous reference for, the specific exhaustion of having done something her body had never done, which was considerable, and nothing she planned to describe in detail to anyone who wasn't going to find it useful. The baby was on her chest, small and indignant about the world she'd arrived into, making the sounds that new people make when they've been evicted from somewhere warmer and quieter and are not yet reconciled to the exchange. Gideon stood in the doorway. He looked at Mara first, checking, the way he always checked the people he was responsible for before anything else. She gave him the smallest nod she had the energy for. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed beside her. He looked at his daughter. He didn't say anything for a long time. The baby's face was doing the complicated, provisional work of being a new face, working out what expressions it had access to, trying several in no particular order. She had, already, a quality of determination in the set of her tiny jaw that Mara recognized without being able to say exactly where she recognized it from. "She looks like she has opinions," Gideon said. "Good," Mara said. "She's going to need them." He looked at her over the baby's head. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm very tired," she said honestly, "and I'm completely all right." He reached out and very carefully, with the same hands that had gone up a burning ladder and restrung fence in the dark and held evidence files in a territorial courthouse, touched his daughter's head. She stopped making noise. She just stopped and looked at him, or looked in his general direction with the unfocused attention of someone who has not yet learned what looking means, and the room was very quiet. Gideon's face did the thing it had done in the eastern pasture, that open, unguarded thing. He didn't try to contain it this time. They named her Margaret, not because Mara had suggested it, but because Gideon had asked her one evening in the fall what she thought about the name, framing it carefully, leaving her room to say no, and she had said, "I think it's right." And it was. Margaret Rourke was 3 months old when she first came downstairs to the kitchen, carried by her father, who had strong opinions about appropriate temperatures for infants and an almost comical amount of caution about door frames. And the kitchen received her the way it had received everything, with the smell of bread and coffee and the particular warmth of a stove that was always going. Caleb came in for his morning coffee and stood in the doorway looking at the baby in Gideon's arms and said, with complete sincerity, "She's very small." "She's the right size," Mara said. "I didn't mean, I just meant—" He tried again. "She looks like she's thinking something." "She always does," Gideon said. Caleb grinned, a real one, the kind that had been rare on his face the first winter Mara had been at Ironwood and was considerably less rare now. He poured his coffee and went back to work. There is a thing about grief that people don't tell you, possibly because it takes too long to understand it. And by the time you do, the people who needed to hear it have already learned it themselves. Grief doesn't end. It becomes part of the structure of a life. Load-bearing, permanent, not to be removed without consequences. The mistake is in waiting for it to be over before you let yourself build anything new. The mistake is in thinking that what you're building on top of it is somehow disrespectful to what came before. Mara had learned this in the year between Thomas's death and Ironwood's kitchen. Gideon had learned it more slowly, in the years between Margaret's death and the morning Mara had knocked on his door. Neither of them had learned it cleanly or without cost. That's not how it works. You learn it through the specific weight of things you can't put down, and eventually you learn to carry them differently, not lighter, but better integrated, more honestly acknowledged. The grief becomes yours in a way it wasn't at the beginning, when it was just enormous and undifferentiated and occupied all available space. You make room, not by diminishing what you lost, by expanding what you can hold. In the spring of the second year, Clara Foss planted her beans again, the variety that had taken 3 years to get right, and this time sent a small packet of the seeds to Mara at Ironwood. Mara planted them in the kitchen garden, in the row she'd rehabilitated the first summer, in the soil she'd been tending for 2 years now, and knew the way she knew the accounts and the stove, and the particular creak of the 4th step on the stairs. They grew. They grew without drama, the way things grow when the conditions are right, and the person tending them pays consistent attention. Not perfectly, because gardens are never perfect, because weather and soil and the specific stubbornness of growing things don't care about perfection, but abundantly. More than she'd expected from a first year. She saved the seeds. She always saved the seeds. Because that's what you do when something grows. You preserve what made it possible, and you carry it forward, and you give some of it away to people who might need it, and you plant again next year. And you keep doing that as long as the land holds and the seasons turn and there are people in the house who need to eat. The door in Ironwood Ranch, the one that had been locked for 7 years, the one that stood at the top of the stairs in the quiet part of the house, stayed open. Not because grief was gone, but because a life was being lived on both sides of it now. That it is the only kind of ending worth having, not the closing of doors, the leaving of them open,